I know that anything I am today started in the Church of Jesus Christ. Amen. Anything that I have been able to do through the years began with the fellowship and the strength that came from a faithful, loving people.
I think that all people have well, a special or divine plan for their lives, but that most people are not conscious of it. They are not in touch with it. But in a very special way, Andy is very keenly aware of his divine calling.
And so it's indeed a pleasure for me to worship with you this morning and to share with you some of the thoughts which are in my heart, and hope that somehow God might use us together to give a word of His, not mine, or yours, to a nation which very desperately needs a ground of faith.
CBS News presents a religious special, A Ground of Faith.
And read one of my favorite passages.
The narrator is Ted Holmes.
It happens to be the passage of...
For Andrew Young, a United Church of Christ minister and the United States ambassador to the United Nations, the pulpit is a platform to challenge people to feed the hungry, house the homeless, clothe the naked, and free the captive. The United Nations is the arena in which he is currently challenged to translate his commitments into political reality. Since 1972, when Andy Young was elected in Georgia's 5th Congressional District as the first black member of Congress from the South since Reconstruction, his career has been widely documented in the public press. Early support of Jimmy Carter in his campaign for the presidency led some to label him the nation's most powerful black. During the 60s, he came to national attention as a trusted colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and as executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Throughout Andy's career, his family, wife Jean, daughters Andrea, Lisa, and Paula, and son Bo, have nourished and sustained him. Today, we examine some of the major influences on his life prior to entering politics. Andy Young was born in New Orleans in the early days of the Depression.
I grew up in a neighborhood that was basically racially mixed. In fact, my brother and I were the only black children in it. There were other black families, but none of them had small children. And so all of my early playmates were Irish and Italian and Polish, and we were the only blacks. So we had to struggle with the problems of race, but in a sense we had a class advantage in that my parents were probably the only people in the neighborhood that were college graduates, and my father was a dentist, so that the basketball goal was in my yard, and we always had the football and the baseball and bat.
Well, Andrew Young and I are almost the same age, approximately a month. I'm approximately a month older. And I guess from probably 5, 6, 7, somewhere around there, that I was old enough to get out and play on the street or on the sidewalk or what have you. And Andrew living only 2 doors away, naturally, and being of the same age, we played quite extensively as children.
Norbert Dunn, a salesman, still lives in New Orleans.
Andrew was faster, but I guess maybe I might have been a little bit heavier. But size-wise, we're about the same height, and to a certain extent, maybe same temperament, you know. I can't recall any arguments, serious, or any fisticuffs between us as children. So I would say that as children, we must have got along pretty fair.
Walter Young, now an Atlanta dentist, is 2 years younger than his brother Andrew.
We had our problems. Most of the problems were typical problems that children might have together. which weren't really, most of the problems weren't race-related at all. There were some race-related problems, but most of the problems were problems of just children getting along with children and people getting along with people.
Mrs. Claire Pecorara, a lifelong New Orleans resident, lived across the street from the Young family.
We all went over to, I think the Young's house got the morning sun. We got the afternoon sun, so we would go sit over on their front steps to kind of sit in the shade. That's why we spent a lot of time on his front steps, more than they did on ours, because it was just nicer. And my brother says my daddy woke Dr. Young up at 2 o'clock in the morning to pull a tooth. I don't remember that. But I wouldn't be surprised, because this was the way these people were. They just charitable and just did for us, you know. When my mother and my father died, well, Mrs. Young was better to me than my own relations.
Yeah, they could play together, and but when they got ready to go to school, then my boys had to go to complete black school, and the other boys in the neighborhood, of course, went to the white school. So then the relationship differed a little bit, because all of their social life was with blacks, and even though in the neighborhood they played with the white children.
The difference didn't actually change, though, as long as they were in the elementary school.
Andrew and Walter attended the Willona C. Jones Elementary School, a segregated black school.
It was called a bucket of blood. And most of my friends' parents were extremely poor, if not on welfare. I remember in 3rd grade, 2 of us got sent to the principal's office for cutting up in the back of the room. And I was about 6, and the other guy was about 12. But we were playing with a knife, playing mumbly pig. And the teacher caught us and sent us to the principal's office. The principal wanted to give us a whipping, or go home and get your parents. Well, we decided we weren't going to take a whipping, so we left. Now, I got home and got my whipping, and my mama brought me right back to school. He never came back. And I didn't see him again from 3rd grade till my 3rd year in college. I was lifeguard at a swimming pool during the summer. And he came in. I didn't recognize him at first, but this guy jumped in the deep end of the pool, went right straight to the bottom. And when we pulled him out and brought him to, I mean, there were tracks of, heroin usage, all down his arm, even in his neck. This was about 1950, 49, 50. And when we began to talk, I realized he had not been back to school, a single day since that day in 3rd grade, when we got put out together. And I realized then that, well, there but for the grace of God go I.
We had a very old and wise grandmother who was blind, and she talked to us for hours and hours. And she basically talked not about race, but she talked about old biblical parables, and she talked to us about good and bad, and doing right and doing wrong. And she taught us basic morality, and it had nothing to do with the color of your skin. It had to do with whether you were good or whether you were bad, whether you could produce and whether you didn't produce.
Everything was segregated. But my parents always explained segregation as being these people not knowing any better. And even when I was 2 and 3 years old, they told me I had to understand the problems of white people as people who were basically insecure about their race, and that, that all men were children of God.
I do remember one time we asked if something about going to the Sanger Theater. All the kids in the neighborhood were going on a Saturday morning. And we asked Dr. Young. He didn't say, he said no, he couldn't go. Andrew couldn't go. And we didn't, well, why couldn't he go, He didn't tell us. But my mother told me after why. Because blacks weren't allowed in the Sanger. I mean, he couldn't have gone in with us. That was the only, and I think it dawned on his son, well, gee, that's right. He's black. And
when we were growing up, there were a lot of streetcars. There were buses too, but the streetcars were very predominant in New Orleans then. And there was a little piece of wood that they put in front of you when you came in, or that you had to move. You had to sit behind the wood. It said for colored only, or for colored patrons, and for white only was on the other side. The white people sat in front, black folks sat in the back. One of the greatest sports of our teenage career was taking those things off of the streetcars and handing them to people out of the window. We had a collection until our parents found out about it and thought we might get put in jail for stealing.
Mrs. Dolly DeSell Adams, a close family friend, now lives in Waco, Texas, where her husband is a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
We didn't know we were supposed to be inferior. We had no idea that we were not supposed to achieve. Our parents and the people in our community told us we could be anything we wanted to be. Now, we had to work a little harder. We understood that. And we understood that we were in segregated schools and this kind of thing. But our capacities, we thought, were as great as anybody else's. We felt that we could be anything we wanted to be.
We could well imagine that we could be airplane pilots or go into politics or become lawyers or whatever. I remember one time Andrew and I had a fantasy that we were going to go to West Point. And I said, no, man, we'll never be able to make it at West Point. And he was saying, well, we'll go together.
I was in school from the time I was 3 years old. And I was always 3 or 4 years younger than everybody else in my class. And I always had a lot of adjustment problems. And so adjusting to people was always my big problem. And I kind of took studies for granted. In fact, I did very little academically. I was a terrible student. I never studied. I deliberately rebelled against everything teachers tried to make me do. And so I would do just enough in school not to get put out. But I never liked school.
He enjoyed concepts. He enjoyed discussing issues. He liked to read, but he didn't want to read what the teacher said read. He wanted to read what he was interested in. And it really was in terms of an issue which interested him. Andrew was the kind of kid who would come into a situation in our homes, both of them. The adults in the home talked to us as though we were adults. And there were conversations between people. It was not just them talking down to us. He'd stand on the edge of an adult conversation in which he was not involved. There might have been children involved, but he'd just sort of stand back there and listen. And then all of a sudden he'd just throw in a thought or a provocative statement or just introduce a new issue, a new element. And the adults in the group always stopped to listen, and the rest of us were always sort of provoked by what he'd said. It might start an argument, it might just start discussion. And he never became a part of it anymore.
I had high hopes for both of them in the professional field. I wanted them to study dentistry, but I would have been satisfied if they'd gone into medicine. Because during those days, that was about the best opportunity a black college man had open to him, in either lawyer in the law profession wasn't very lucrative in those days for blacks. And I guess I thought less of the ministry than any other profession.
Oh, well, we really shouldn't have been surprised that he would go into the ministry. We live in Central Church practically. We're engaged in all the activities of the church or in the denomination. So they were always exposed to a religious life.
I was given a kind of absolutist morality, which was also related to race. I mean, my mother and father used to say, you know, you're black. You can't be half right. You can't even be 90% right. You got to be 200% right. See, otherwise you're wrong, you know. And if there's ever a situation where there's a competition between you and somebody white and you're just as good, you can forget it. You know, you got to do everything better. Like there was never any question that I would go to college. I mean, it was assumed that I would get all the education that I wanted and my parents would pay for it. So that they saw that as their responsibility. They believed in education at all cost.
Andy graduated from Gilbert Academy, a private high school operated by the Methodist Church. His first year in college was spent at Dillard University, 2 blocks from the Young home. He transferred to Howard University, Washington, D.C., in his sophomore year.
He graduated from Howard University with a BS degree in pre-med with intentions of going into medical school. And his whole life changed during that summer. He forgot about medicine and forgot about his old college sweetheart. He was sort of engaged to a girl. He just changed and decided he wanted to do other things in life.
You were still swimming your way through college.
Yeah. I guess that was something of an awkward time for me because I was much younger than most of the guys in school, and I'd been fighting for 2 years sort of to prove my manhood. All of a sudden a preacher comes in. And the concept of manhood that I was working on was not exactly what the preacher was all about. And it was more that you challenged my value system and made me ask questions about what was the meaning of life generally. I don't think I was ready to think about things like that. I was having too much fun.
The Reverend Nicholas Hood became pastor of Andy's home church, Central Congregational, New Orleans, in 1950. He's now pastor of Central Congregational Church, Detroit, Michigan, and a member of the Detroit City Council.
When my wife and I showed up in your parents' home, this was you resented that very highly, the fact that you would have a preacher in your home.
Well, you have to remember that up to that time, my image of the ministry had not been a wholesome one. The ministry was stereotyped as people who exploited the poor, who ate a whole lot of chicken and drove Cadillacs.
You are the one who has reminded me that I had some influence in your life, but I really never thought about that. Which has led me to believe that many of the good things that happen through us happen in spite of us.
Right after graduation, when we stopped at Kings Mountain, your classmate from Yale that was on his way to Rhodesia as a missionary, I can't even remember his name. But I remember Dr. McDowell, who was a black missionary in Angola.
That's right.
And all of you crossed my path about that time, and in some sense, you set, I mean, the things that I'm talking about now, that in some ways the rest of America is just becoming aware of, I was challenged to face by you and other people in the church, that was 27 years ago. And it was the challenge of people who were giving their lives to others.
I believe, too, that much of this process was begun back there with your grandmother, with her religious faith, and your mother, who never got off of her knees, was always praying, and she'd look at you, she'd have to pray, because in those early days, I thought your brother was going to be the minister, and I thought you were going to be something other than a minister. So you can see how wrong I was. But nevertheless, I feel, in looking back, that there's been this process at work in your life where God really has been guiding you and directing you.
Well, I hope that's true, and I hope it continues to be true. I hate to blame everything I do and say on God.
Reverend Hood asked Andy to ride with him to a United Christian Youth Conference in Texas. Andy expected to visit a college classmate in what he thought would be a neighboring town. When he discovered that San Antonio was 200 miles away, he stayed at the conference.
I remember both of us being very nervous driving through those Texas woods looking for that conference center, wondering whether we were going to find faith or get lynched. And I remember you doing the Bible study for that conference, and the passages that you selected for study are still passages that I remember. The other important dynamic in that conference was race. That was the first time I'd met any Southern white people that were dealing with their own racial training in the light of their religious faith. That for all of them, it was perhaps their first interracial experience.
Well, the warmth that we found there was a warmth that we had not experienced back in New Orleans, because even in New Orleans at that time, we did not have an interracial fellowship. But it was in a youth conference where we found this oneness which we find in our religious faith.
In a sense, it was almost as though if this religious business was powerful enough to overcome hundreds of years of traditional racism to any extent, it was something I had to take seriously.
I didn't realize that something was happening to you until we were driving back, you were driving. And when you ran through a very important intersection without stopping, and the car wasn't necessarily going fast, it was almost as if you were in a daze, I suddenly realized I better take the wheel.
It shocked me totally when he decided to go into ministry. Now, it wasn't surprising to me that he was religious. Andrew and I went to church together, to each other's churches as children. We had, mutual respect, even though we were different denominations. There was never any indication in his demeanor that he was interested in a religious calling. I thought of him as a political science teacher. I'd even thought of him in terms of politics, but never in terms of a religious calling. So when this came, I was sort of skeptical. And we had quite a number of little conversations about surrounding this newfound calling and direction in his life. And it took me a while for him to convince me that this was what he really wanted.
During the conference in Texas, the staff of the United Christian Youth Movement invited Andy to spend a year in New England as a volunteer worker in the Call to United Christian Youth Action.
I jumped at the opportunity because I figured that would give me a chance to really sort out my own thinking. The call to United Christian Youth Action was an idea of the United Christian Youth Movement, which made up at that time 34 Protestant and Orthodox denominations, to try to involve 1 million young people from all over the country to deepen their commitment to Christ.
Tom Dent, a poet and author of the recently published collection of poetry Magnolia Street, is a lifelong friend.
I'm not a religious person myself. He is, and we have argued it, but you know, when he talks about faith, it has to do with his religious faith. I think that the type of person Andrew is an actor, is somebody who generates around positives. I ask questions. My questions end up with other questions. Andrew ends up with answers. Anybody who looks for answers has to have faith. Anybody like me who looks for questions is always questioning faith. Faith in what?
We've had enough hard times, and we're looking around for a brighter day. And we have faith in this nation that somehow God can still work his miracles, and that this nation might find a way to release the captives, that there can be good news to the poor in this nation. And you know, the only good news you can give to poor folk in this nation is that they don't have to be poor anymore. We pray each day the Lord's Prayer, and we say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And we want it to be done here in Atlanta. We want it to be done in Vine City. We want it to be done on this earth. And this day, not tomorrow, but this day we want our daily bread. And we don't want anybody giving us a handout because we don't want to be captives. We want an opportunity to earn our living. We want an opportunity to do creative work in this society.
While still a volunteer in the call to United Christian Youth Action, Andy enrolled in Hartford Theological Seminary, Hartford, Connecticut. The following summer, he met Gene Childs.
I was born in Marion, Alabama, which is a very small town in Alabama, about 30 miles from Selma. And it's a very old town, and it was a very segregated town when I was a child.
Oh, I was the pastor for one summer after my first year in seminary. I went back to Alabama, and Gene was just home from college.
It seems as if Andrew's mother had persuaded him to come there because she thought it was nearer to New Orleans and she'd get a chance to see her son sometime during the summer.
I was also pretty disillusioned with black middle-class women, and I'd kind of decided I wasn't going to marry. I was seriously considering celibacy. And when I met Jean, who was, well, I went to her house before she got home, and there was a Revised Standard Version of the New Testament that was underlined. There was a senior life-saving certificate on the wall for her, and I looked at the books on the shelf in her library, and I looked at her mother and father, and I decided the Lord had sent me there to get a wife.
You know, in those small towns, they couldn't afford to really pay the pastor an adequate salary, so they would provide him some minimum salary, and then they would provide housing and food for him. And he used to go around from each parish, and he would eat at each home. And so the week that I came home was the week that he was eating at my parents' home. And so I actually met him there on one of those occasions when he was coming down for his daily meals.
And even really before I met her, almost, I mean, these were the things that I'd been looking for, a woman with some religious commitment. who was, athletically inclined, and from a mother and father, she had to be, she had to be a very charming and beautiful person.
Well, my first impression was that, he looks like a nice, clean-cut young man with awfully large ears. But we really liked each other, I think, from the very beginning. And we began to talk to each other, and we became friends immediately.
Jean and Andy were married 2 years later, after Jean graduated from college. During Andy's last year in seminary, Jean taught school in Hartford. Andy was ordained to the ministry in Central Congregational Church, his home church in New Orleans. In his charge to the newly ordained minister, the Reverend Homer McEwen warned him to keep his bags packed. To be effective in the ministry is to risk being run out of town.
1953, my wife and I went to Europe to work in a work camp in Austria, and these were refugees from Eastern Europe, mostly from Yugoslavia, Romania, people fleeing from communism. And I think there were representatives in my work camp from about 14 different countries. That was my first international experience. We also spent a summer hitchhiking around Europe, and her sister was working in Berlin, which was then behind the Iron Curtain, and we went in to spend a week with her in Berlin, and I guess got a sense of what post-war Europe was like.
Andy was appointed pastor of Bethany Congregational Church, Thomasville, Georgia, in the summer of 1955.
Thomasville, Georgia was the time when I reclaimed my roots. That New Orleans was always a very cosmopolitan kind of black bourgeoisie existence. Thomasville was still culturally, and I had two churches, one in Thomasville and one in Beachton, Georgia. And Beachton more especially was Southern plantation life. The songs that people sang were still the old spirituals from slavery. It was rural poverty in the Deep South. And that was where I began to kind of develop a racial identity, you might say, or an appreciation for black culture. There's a lot of difference between the Fisk Jubilee Singers. That's an adaptation between old Negro spirituals and what's acceptable to a Western audience, and the real nitty-gritty of a country church, where when I began to use the congregational order of worship, but anytime I'd pause, some old sister would start up an old hymn, and it would be, 15 minutes before I could get the service back. Or when I would sit down and prepare my sermons and have a very well thought out notion of what I was going to say, but the audience response was, amen, make it plain, tell the truth, and they'd get you so worked up that you forget what you had on the paper and go on and preach. In a sense, it was my personally restoring a sense of that kind of identity.
And it was sort of an exciting time. I mean, it was like you felt like you were a pioneer in some respects, because there was so little there, except there were people who were concerned and interested, in maintaining the church. But it was just so very small, and the resources were, such a minimum.
He was really the favorite of the youth of this community. His church was not populated with many young people, but he organized a youth group there at his church, and that group grew into more than 125 young people in this town. And he played with them, he disciplined them, he worked with them.
Mr. Bill Morris was principal of Thomasville's Black High School. Mrs. Lucille Morris was the treasurer of the Thomasville Church.
He thought that not only did these young people need to develop their minds, they needed to develop their bodies, and he thought that involvement and participation would help them to develop the whole person.
Mr. Robert Holton owns a body repair shop in Thomasville. Mr. James Bryant is the shop foreman.
No, basically didn't have anything to do. We just played in the woods and cut down trees and run through people's yards and maybe knock out a few windows here or there. We had nothing to do with our time until he came along.
When Andy come along, television in our area wasn't popular, so we really didn't have much recreation. But it's one thing I like to put emphasis on, that he was the type of man that a young boy growing up would want to be like. As Bryant was saying, he gave a young boy something to do with his time other than just roam around and get into little misdemeanors.
Like most of the South at that time, the population was overwhelmingly, and there was the adults would go north to work, and they would send the young children back to live with the grandparents. So you had a population that was probably, almost 60% under 18. And we had a big block of land. And I would just get the kids, and we cleared it off. We made a playground. We organized a basketball team and a baseball team. And I used to take them to conferences around the country. I took them to visit colleges. I did the kind of things for an entire community that my parents had done for me. But there were no parents, parents were unable to do that for those kids.
Mr. Benjamin Hatcher owns a funeral home in Thomasville.
I feel that he really encouraged me and everybody, all of the members of the Boy Scout troop, the youth fellowship, to do unto others as we should have them to do unto us. And he really encouraged you to try to be somebody in life.
No, at the time, I never thought about owning a shop and a body shop. But I still think when you teach a young fella how to do for himself, how to respect people, how to stand on his own, how to manage with what you have, that he can fit into any phase of business.
I think I went to the South also with a kind of romanticization of the poor, that the poor were going to save the world. And after 3 years in Georgia, I realized that mainly the poor wanted to be middle class. I was rejecting my own middle class background, saying that the middle and upper classes were lost, the world could only be saved by the poor. And you spend 3 years with the poor and find out that all they're trying to do is be middle class, then you have to come back and reassess. You begin to realize that, this class analysis of change just doesn't work any more than a racial analysis of change.
The more we talked about it, and the more frustrated Andrew became in trying to sort of meet the needs of these people as a minister, I think the more he began to realize that, you just couldn't change the people's lives, that, it was the larger society that was involved and responsible. So when the offer came for him to move to the National Council of Churches as an associate director of youth, he had terribly mixed feelings, and of course I was extremely hesitant about making such a move. I was quite comfortable and content to be a teacher in this little town, and for him to be a beloved minister, and sort of enjoy the warmth of the people around us, and we were just sort of content.
The Reverend Donald Newby directed the National Council of Churches Youth Department.
At that time, the National Council of Churches had a sizable staff. This was 1957. But out of the entire executive staff, there was only one non-white person, I think, and this person was a staff member assigned to race relations, which, was sort of a necessity. And one of the first questions that I had from one of the executives was, my basic question is, have you chosen him because he's the best man or because he's black? I really hadn't given it much thought to that point. We had chosen him because he's the best man and his ability to relate to kids. But the answer really was both.
Dr. Philip Potter, General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Geneva, Switzerland, was at that time a member of the World Council Youth Department based in New York.
We were operating in the 1950s. And you have to remember the 1950s were the period of McCarthyism. It was a period of the Cold War. It was a period of the nuclear competition between the major powers. And it was a period of the youth, the silent generation. In that silence was a non-involved attitude among young people. And our job was an immensely difficult job, how to rouse them to be concerned about what's going on in their world. And how to do that from the basis, on the basis of a sound faith.
One of the things that we got into, largely because of Andy's role in the staff and because of the work with the Look Up and Live series, where we were trying to address non-church young people, was this whole question of the youth culture. Was a fairly new concept at that time to speak of the youth culture or youth subculture in the culture.
The CBS television network presents Look Up and Live. Today, the first chapter in a teleplay by Stephen Guthers entitled Two Alone. Part 1, The Ugly One. Our host is the Reverend Andrew J. Young, Associate Director of the Department of Youth Work, National Council of Churches.
That, of course, was Dick Van Dyke, giving his pantomime impression of the subject of the drama you'll be seeing in a few moments, The Ugly One. It's about a boy, 15, 16, that age when boys seem to be all feet and legs and ears, nothing but extremities. It's no longer permissible for them to be a part of the family. By this time, every boy has begun to clip the apron strings and moves out into the world to try to be a man. I think Look Up and Live, working with a television show, introduced me to mass media and gave me an appreciation of the methods of communication, the value of communication, and just how the media operates in this country. That was very valuable to me when I got to the civil rights movement.
Well, I think one of Andrew's limitations is that he's never really had an urban black experience of the type that we mean when we say the ghetto. And I don't think he has a very strong perception of, I think abstractly he does, but he's never really lived around people who've been really desperate and living totally in despair or have turned to narcotics consistently out of despair and so forth. And, but I think that he can have the sympathy, but he hasn't had that experience. His experience has been almost totally middle class. Anyone who has a sense of vigor and, a feeling for change, as Andrew certainly had and has, would be someone who was interested in what young people were doing. But as I say, this didn't include the experience of those young people who were self-destructing, say in Harlem. Andrew didn't have an experience like Claude Brown, man-child. That's a world foreign to him, to a great extent to me too.
We used to invite our friends over, and we had one friend that every time he came to dinner, he would bring a bottle of wine. And, you know, the only time I had wine before was in communion in church. And so this was a new experience. And, you know, we would sit around and listen to nice music and you know, and enjoy our friends and talk and stay up late. And one night we were sitting down and we were watching the television, and the Nashville story came on. And we saw these kids from Nashville, from Fisk and the other universities, being jailed, and we saw them in the cells, and we heard them talking. And, you know, we sat there in that comfort of that Queens home with our carpet and our fireplace and our wine, and we looked at each other and we said, why are we here?
1960. Sit-ins, boycotts, and freedom rides escalated throughout the South. In 1961, the Field Foundation funded a voter education project through the United Church of Christ, which Andy was invited to direct. The project was based in Atlanta at the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
That program was one in which we recruited people from around the southern and the border states to come into a 5-day residential training program.
Dorothy Cotton was associate director of the project and later became its director when Andy became executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
A majority of the people in many of the communities from which they came could not read and write. And so people learned to spell words like V-O-T-E. They learned to go back home and teach people how to spell words like M-A-Y-O-R or how to spell sheriff. But the thing was to talk about what that particular office meant and how that particular office affected their lives. And so the citizenship education training was all intertwined with the literacy training.
We were looking for the people who had PhD minds and natural leadership ability who had never had a chance to get an education. And we trained them to train their neighbors. And I contend that that was the basis of the civil rights movement. That was the grassroots leadership base on which Martin Luther King later began to build a mass protest movement.
In St. Augustine, which I think was one of the most violent of places where we worked, we were into night marches, and it led a good number of those marches, and those who would oppose us were waiting downtown in what we used to call the old slave quarters. I think everybody called it that. We were told that it was a place in St. Augustine where they used to auction off the slaves back in the old days, and everybody had been really programmed to stay in line no matter what happened. And I realized then that kind of discipline really took. It was really deeply ingrained because we looked and saw 2 or 3 folk or several folk were attacked. The line was attacked, really, but the majority of the folks stayed in line. But I looked and I saw Andy on the ground, and it was really all that we could do. I think Ed Winter was marching beside me at that time, but it was all that we could do to keep from rushing to his rescue. But Andy came through that apparently all right. He can even joke about it now. The human spirit can only take so much of that, and if we'd been out with people and had been beaten and were weary, I think we sought more often than not to sing songs together and, you know, to josh around and to laugh a little. We sang the songs of the movement out of many moods when we were playing and when we just needed to express whatever was going on with us at the time. I used to do Deo, for example. Deo, Deo, daylight coming and it won't be long. And so we changed the words, of course, and sing freedom, 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 freedom come and it won't be long. And then we'd go around the room and everybody would make up a verse. Or like, oh, you know, if you miss me from the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere. Yeah, I mean, in the days when we had to sit in the back of the bus, come on up to the front of the bus, 'cause I'll be riding up there. And in the middle of voter registration drive, if you miss me from the cotton patch and you can't find me nowhere, come on down to City Hall. I'll be mayor over there. I'll be mayor over there. I'll be mayor over there. Come on down to City Hall. I'll be mayor over there. And that was, you know, kind of fun and playful, but I guess we meant it, didn't we?
And that was probably the happiest time in my life. Everything seemed to work out right. It was rough, but the issues were very clear. You know, it was black and white. And yet, I don't mean that in a racial sense. I mean that in a moral sense. And the issues were very clear-cut. Good guys and bad guys is a better way to say it. And we knew what we had to do. And we had a group of people that were pretty much committed to doing it.
The Reverend Joseph Lowery, pastor of Atlanta's Central United Methodist Church, is now president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Andy was supportive and gave leadership to those of us who believed that one's witness and one's longing for heaven has to be tempered by one's attempt to introduce heavenly characteristics to one's earthly existence, and that you can't be holy without loving your fellow man. You can't work for the kingdom of God without understanding that the reign of God on earth means a just reign, a justice, as Amos said, must roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And to us, this means food for the hungry, clothing for the naked, housing for those who are inadequately housed. It means justice in our system of jurisprudence. It means full employment and or income for all of God's children. And Andy was a strong advocate of this and kept this stream of thought running through everything that we did.
Randy, you know, is a black man, and he has got his Christianity out of the black experience of over 300 years. And what has kept black people alive is this tremendous sense that there's a greater power than the principalities and powers, that the miracles can take place. I think there is that shrewdness, that what I call that Christian shrewdness about Andy. Even if you disagree with him ideologically or in some expression of policy, he does have this tremendous conviction that somehow or other right will win, you know. And in an age of so much cynicism in politics, and cynicism is the quality of small men, Andy brings this bigness of one who refuses to believe that there isn't liberation somewhere. And that's part of the great black Christian tradition in this country. And of course, it's a biblical tradition.
I think that there has always been a tendency for the church to produce some saints who feel as though it's their calling to set forth in a clear and uncompromising way what the word of the Lord is in our time. I've never felt that I should be one of those. Remember Peter Marshall used to talk about the saints of rank and file, or people getting involved. Reinhold Niebuhr's notion, Paul Tillich, was of a kind of Christianity that continued to live in tension and dialogue with the world. And I'm much more inclined toward that kind of Christianity, because I believe in this world. You know, I love this world even, and I'm very much aware of its shortcomings and its faults, but I can see progressive religious evolution in mankind. Somehow, I think, in Christianity, the whole phenomena of incarnation is that the Spirit of God must be incarnate, that is, made flesh in the people and the institutions which make up our government. But we do that not through our religious institutions or claiming any authority from God or from the church, but we do that as the church inspires us as individuals to enter into the political and economic life, into the corporate world of, you know, responsibility, to produce goods to feed the hungry, that, you know, all things are under the judgment of God and should serve the glory of God.
And I say to you this morning, church, that that's where we are as a nation. We're asking, can this nation live? Can the dry bones of this divided nation be hooked up? Can black people and white people learn to live together? Can rich people and poor people, Protestant and Catholic, Jew and Gentile, can we all come together as one people? Can we make sense out of our cities? Can we start this nation going again? Can we feed the hungry of the earth? Can we heal all of the sick and divided? And somehow this morning I feel in my heart that the answer is yes. I feel in my heart that we know that these bones can live, because we know they lived in Ezekiel's time. I feel in my heart that even the sinners that haven't been near the church can be touched by the faith of those who are faithful. For you know, when they sing their blues, they borrow from the church. And so people saying, trouble in mine, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, because the sun's going to shine in my back door one of these days. So whether you are a believer or an unbeliever, somehow when the Spirit of God gets to moving across the land, you begin to believe that the sun is going to shine not only in your back door, but in your front door as well. And so I say to you this morning that it's time for the sun to shine on America once again. And that sun shining comes out of the faith of a great people. And I can see a new day. And so I want you this morning to make a pledge with me to trust in the Lord. I will trust